Hello, and welcome to this Hatfield Museum and History Society Community Program presentation titled This and That, an Eclectic Look at Hatfield History. I'm Larry Stevens, President of the Society. Tonight's program is our 15th annual This and That program, and like all the other This and That presentations, I will be presenting just a little bit of history about a whole lot of different topics, not necessarily related, and in no particular chronological order. And like the other This and That programs, there are a good number of photos that have never been seen before in any other program. I'm going to start off tonight's program with some photos taken at the Hatfield racetrack that I have never seen before. They are from a race in October of 1935, and you can see that they had quite a big grandstand, and it looks like the seats were packed for this race day. Here's the racers kicking up some dust as they zip around the 1/2 mile dirt track heading for the front stretch. And this photo again captures, from a different viewpoint, the racers rounding the 4th turn as they head for the finish line. Here are some folks that got to view the race from the infield of the track. Perhaps they were the pit crews, I'm not sure. And here's an unknown driver in a 1932 Ford race car named the Freddie Special. This picture, taken around 1904, is our oldest photograph of the meeting house of the Hatfield German Baptist Brethren, or Dunkards, on Cowpath Road. That's John Munsinger Sr. seen standing outside of the church, which was built in 1867. Mr. Munsinger owned a farm on Cowpath Road, just a few hundred yards south of the meeting house, and he was a charter member of the church. Notice the horse sheds behind the church on the right side of the picture. The sheds were built in 1887, and each member would build his own shed. The owner's name was then affixed to each shed. These horse sheds stood until they were torn down in 1934. Also notice that there are 3 doors in the side of the building, although one is hidden by a tree. This photo, a recent addition to the museum collection, was taken a few years later and shows an addition to the building, which was built in 1905 to accommodate the growing congregation. Notice that the meeting house now has 4 doors, and there is now also a kerosene lantern on a post to help light the way to the church. The congregation continued to grow, and by 1928, a new, larger meeting house was built and dedicated in September of that year. This photo of the new church, I believe, was taken shortly after it was built in 1928. The closing of the Lansdale Brethren Church in 1950 resulted in an increase in attendance at the Hatfield Church. Additions to both ends of the building were constructed to accommodate the increase in membership, and this is pretty much how it appears today. Hatfield Borough had quite a few textile-related businesses in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and one of the longer-lasting textile businesses in the borough was the Hanson Textile Company on East Broad Street. Hatfield longtimers may remember Leroy Hartman, and thanks to him we have these interior photos of the Hanson factory. This is Leroy hard at work in the trim department. And another photo of Leroy focused on his work. This is one of Hanson's Wildman circular knitting machines. And this appears to be some type of loom machine. And this photo shows fabric coming out of the loom. This is a display of some of Hanson's products, including washcloths, hand towels, and pot holders. In January of 1988, the Hanson business was sold and its operations were relocated down to North Carolina. Another textile business in the borough was the Select Hosiery Mills, which operated in this factory on West Vine Street. The business started in this building around 1941 and were the manufacturer of sapphire stockings. The company operated here for 11 years until 1956. The Brooks Rotometer Company, founded in 1946, was outgrowing their Lansdale building in 1957, and so they moved to Hatfield Borough into the former stocking factory. This newspaper photo from October 1957 accompanied an article about the business moving to Hatfield. And they are still there today, 67 years later. The building has changed a lot over the years, but the old smokestack remains the same. In August 1941, Hatfield Borough hired 36-year-old Herbert Kreider to the position of Chief of Police of the borough at a salary of $130 a month. Less than a year later, in May of 1942, Chief Kreider was called to serve his country in World War II. Now, before I move on, a brief side note. You might be interested to know that this photo, as well as a good number of others in tonight's presentation, have been enhanced by an artificial intelligence program. It's exciting to be able to bring more detail to these old photos with this new technology. To better illustrate, this is a close-up of the Chief's face from the original photo in our collection on the left, and on the right is what it looks like after AI enhancement. Quite an improvement, I think, bringing some sharpness to his face and especially the detail of the Chief's hat badge. So I thought you might be interested to know that little tidbit of information. So Chief Kreider was called to military service with the U.S. Navy in May of 1942. Over the next 2 years, 3 other men were hired to serve as borough police chief, but none of them worked out for too long. In May of 1944, Hatfield Borough Council hired Leonard Spade to serve as temporary police chief in Chief Kreider's absence. Spade patrolled the town during the day, and George Dinger was hired to patrol at night. Dogs running loose was apparently a big problem in Hatfield Borough in the 1940s, evidenced by this headline from an October 1944 Hatfield Times newspaper. The article went on to report that several women had bad scares by dogs that had torn shopping bags from their hands. In another incident, a small dog tied up in its own yard was badly mangled by another dog that was running loose. So borough residents were warned to keep their canines tied up or risk having them shot on sight. Herb Kreider was honorably discharged from the armed forces in September of 1944 after serving approximately 19 months in the South Pacific. He returned to the U.S. and spent some time readjusting to civilian life, and then in April 1945 resumed his duties as Chief of Police of Hatfield Borough. Dogs running loose in Hatfield Borough apparently continued to be a problem into the 1950s. A 1951 newspaper article once again warned residents to keep their dogs leashed or risk having them shot. Fortunately, police these days take a little more compassionate stance on loose dogs. As time marches on, there are fewer and fewer folks that remember the Hatfield of the 1960s and 70s or earlier. But if you were living in Hatfield back then, you would probably remember Horace Inky Davis. Since 1922, Inky operated a restaurant, pool hall, and news agency at 102 East Broad Street, right next to the Hatfield trolley station. He continued to operate the business until his retirement in the early 1970s, after which his son ran the business until 1978. Inky's grandson, Bob Davis, contacted me right before the January program, Wreck on the Rails, with some information about a fatal trolley accident here in Hatfield that I wasn't aware of, and I wasn't able to add it to that program. So I thought I would add it to this program. He reported that Inky Davis's aunt, Miss Emma Reifmeyer, was killed in 1917 on the day after Christmas in a tragic trolley accident here in Hatfield. Emma and two other women had walked from Lansdale to attend a prayer meeting in South Hatfield and were returning home around 8:45 p.m. when Emma was struck by a southbound trolley at the Vine Street crossing. She died from her head injuries. In 1914, the Hatfield Post Office moved into this new building on East Lincoln Avenue, right next to the Heidelberg Reformed Church. Seen here in front of the newly opened post office is Postmaster Jacob Hollenbach in the center, Wilson Culp on the right, and Ralph Swartley on the left. The financial edition of the Philadelphia Evening Ledger from November 1916 reported that someone broke into the post office around 4 a.m., blew open the safe, and got away with money, stamps, and other items of value. The article went on to say that, knowing that the town did not have police, the robbers took no precautions to muffle the sound of the explosion and then went about the robbery in apparent leisure. The article also reported that only a week earlier, the Hatfield Times building, just a stone's throw away from the post office, was also a victim of robbery after their safe was also blown open. The Hatfield Post Office moved around quite a bit in the late 1800s and early 1900s until December 1922, when it finally settled in to its longtime home at the corner of Broad and Cherry Streets. However, 30 years later, the post office was starting to outgrow their building. In April of 1951, bids were solicited for a new, larger post office building, with the U.S. government appropriating $95,000 towards the building of a new post office. In October of that year, however, the post office renewed its 10-year lease for the Broad and Cherry Street location, and the community knew it would be a long time before they saw a new building. Finally, in May of 1961, the Penn Valley Times newspaper published this artist rendering of the proposed new Hatfield Post Office building. It's interesting that the artist foresaw a 10-story high-rise building for Hatfield, which fortunately has not come to pass. A year later, in May of 1962, construction of the new post office was completed and a dedication ceremony was held that month. Back to the racetrack again. This new photo in our collection captures racers zipping around Hatfield's dirt oval in a 1949 race. Some of the racers seen here include Bill Schindler in number 3, Larry Bloomer in number 7, and Len Duncan against the fence in number 9. Most folks know by now that Mario Andretti often raced at the Hatfield Speedway, and as he tells it, one of the most fantastic crashes of his racing career, with the possible exception of his 1969 crash at Indianapolis Speedway, occurred at the Hatfield Speedway. It was around 1960, and Andretti was just getting his start in racing. He was an enthusiastic young driver and would race anything that was available. Someone asked him to drive their car in a race at Hatfield, and Andretti eagerly agreed, even though he felt that the car was a dud, with a body that was coming off of the frame. It was so bad that officials didn't even think it should race. But with more guts than brains, and all wild to go racing, he argued with the officials that he was the driver and that the car was his responsibility. The officials relented, and the car was allowed to race. Andretti started out all right, but when he tried to sneak by a guy on the outside, his car hit the irregular, warped wooden guardrail, and his car became airborne. It flew high in the sky and came down on top of another car. The engine shot out of Andretti's car, hitting another car with such force that it almost turned the other car over. When Andretti's car came to a stop, the battery was on his lap, with battery acid leaking all over him. When he crawled from the wreck, the first thing he did, in his own words, was to, quote, check to see if I still had everything I needed to remain among the living, end quote. Then he noticed something very interesting. He was slowly becoming naked, right there in front of the spectators. His overalls had been saturated with sulfuric acid from the battery and were disintegrating. Someone quickly stepped in with a blanket, though, to save him from further embarrassment. In the early 1990s, Hatfield Borough did a major overhaul to its sign ordinance in order to reduce sign clutter in the town. This meant the end for this trailer sign, which was used to advertise specials at Dominic's Pizza on South Main Street. This photo shows the business's owner, Ed Van Arsdale, posting a message on his sign to let the public know that its days were numbered. One of the favorite winter ice skating ponds in the area was Alabak's Pond. This circa 1950 photo shows some unidentified folks having a great time on the frozen pond, which is now a part of Heritage Park on Tulmenson Avenue. I love old maps, and here's an old map that I came across recently that I had never seen before. It's a map of Pennsylvania as it appeared in 1759, and it's the oldest map I found that shows Hatfield. In 1759, the land that is now Montgomery County was still a part of Philadelphia County, and Hatfield Township had been formed just 17 years earlier in 1742. Beyond the borders of Bucks, Philadelphia, and Chester counties, the land of Pennsylvania was mostly unsettled. Here's a closer look of Montgomery County on the map. Notice that directly under Hatfield is marked the Plain. This area was, according to some historic sources, said to be the most level ground in eastern Pennsylvania. Early settlers called this area the Plain because of its lack of hills. And when the Mennonite Meeting House was established in this area around 1765, they adapted the name Plains Mennonite, Hatfield's oldest church. I have really just started to go through our recently digitized Hatfield newspaper collection, which dates back to 1893. This photo shows the masthead of the very first edition of the Hatfield Invincible from April 28, 1893. It has been fun learning even more about Hatfield history and coming across photos that I had never seen before, like this one of C.J. Buckley. I have mentioned C.J. Buckley many times in past programs, but until now never had a photo of him, and I think that it's nice to be able to put a face to the historic figures in Hatfield's history. Chauncey J. Buckley first came to Hatfield apparently in 1892 after purchasing the general store business at the corner of Broad and Market Streets, previously owned by the recently deceased Enos F. Hackman. Hackman was also Hatfield's postmaster at that time, and apparently the postmastership passed directly to Buckley along with the store business. This photo is taken from the railroad station property, and that's Buckley's General Store on the right, and Chester Knipes Hotel is on the left. When talk began in 1898 of forming Hatfield Village into a borough, Chauncey Buckley immediately got on board. After the borough was successfully formed, Buckley was elected to the first council of the new town, and when the first borough council held its first meeting and elected officers, Chauncey Buckley was elected to be Hatfield Borough's first council president. In March of 1906, Buckley was elected to be the borough's burgess, or mayor. He retired from that position 10 months later, in January of 1907, because he had developed other interests. He wanted to run for the position of Montgomery County Sheriff. He did win the election, and in January 1908, sold the general store business to Isaac C. Detweiler and moved to Norristown to take on his new position. He served as sheriff until 1912, after which he apparently operated another grocery business in Norristown. An arsonist was targeting Hatfield barns back in 1898, prompting someone, possibly an insurance company, to post this notice in the Hatfield Invincible newspaper, offering a $2,000 reward for the arrest and conviction of the perpetrators. $2,000 was a hefty sum in 1898, equivalent to around $75,000 in today's money, so this was quite a substantial reward. I found no subsequent article to indicate that the culprits were ever caught. These new photos in our collection show the aftermath of a 1955 fire at the Hatfield Speedway. Damage to the main grandstand from the fire was estimated at $10,000. Flames, which probably started from a smoldering trash fire left by Speedway workmen the day before, were discovered by livestock auction employees leaving after the weekly auction was held right next to the Speedway. The Hatfield Fire Company was called at 12:45 a.m. and after exhausting their water supply, called the Fairmont of Lansdale, Calmer, and Skippack Fire Companies to assist. The grandstand structure, which was built in 1921 when the track was first constructed, was enclosed for storage beneath the stands. About half of the building and more than 500 seats were destroyed in the blaze. Here's a humorous little news note that appeared in the November 1955 Penn Valley Times newspaper. It reports that a toilet seat was stolen from a new ranch house on Coffle Road during its open house. Someone must have been pretty desperate for a toilet seat. I am often amazed and quite surprised sometimes by which of our Facebook posts draw the most attention. This recent post on the main hotel drew an unusual amount of interest, with 645 Facebookers liking the post and 75 of them sharing it on their own page. This is great compared to the average post receiving maybe 225 likes and 25 shares. But it is nothing compared to the crazy response received from a photo that was not even taken in Hatfield. A post about the Liberty Bell and its brief visit to Hatfield. It received 1,500 likes and was shared to 434 other Facebook pages. So since there was so much interest in the subject on Facebook, I thought that I would expound on it a bit in this program. For 100 years after the nation's independence, while Philadelphians could easily visit Independence Hall to gaze upon the nation's iconic symbol of freedom, the Liberty Bell, the rest of the country could only dream about seeing the 2,000-pound bell. To give the rest of the nation the opportunity to see the bell for themselves, between 1885 and 1904, the Liberty Bell went on 6 road trips. One of these trips was to the World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, which was held from May through October 1893 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World, only 1 year late. In April 1893, the Liberty Bell was hoisted onto an open rail car and hung from a yoke on the special open train car, surrounded by a brass railing and guards to deter visitors from getting too close. The special Liberty Bell train passed through Lancaster and Harrisburg on its way west towards Chicago. At stops along the way, parents sometimes lifted their children up over the rails to kiss the bell, while others got the guards to rub medals or trinkets against the bell to obtain souvenirs of the occasion. This is the Liberty Bell on display at the Chicago World's Fair. Visitors came from all over the world to attend the World's Columbian Exposition / Chicago World's Fair. You may find this interesting. Several products introduced at the 1893 World's Fair are still quite popular today, including shredded wheat, diet carbonated soda, Aunt Jemima syrup and pancake mix, and Wrigley's Juicy-Fruit gum. Something else that you may find interesting: an amusement ride that dominated the skyline at the fair was the world's first Ferris wheel. Pennsylvanian inventor George Washington Ferris designed the 250-foot Ferris wheel for the World's Fair. The wheel had 36 cars, each capable of holding 60 people, so a fully loaded wheel would carry 2,160 people. As I said, people came from all over the world to attend the fair. One Hatfield Invincible news note reported, "A certain man in this town planned to go to the World's Fair in a saving way. He says he wants to walk to Chicago along the railroad and eat grass for his nourishment. We would advise him to get an extra set of teeth before starting." Now, we're not certain if this is the same fellow or not, but in June of 1893, a Hatfield Invincible article reported that Wilson Ott was the first person from Hatfield to attend the fair. The final day of the fair was October 31st, 1893, and the Liberty Bell was readied for its return to Philadelphia. It returned on a different rail line than when it was going to Chicago, giving even more people the opportunity to see the bell in person. On Saturday, November 4th, 1893, the bell traveled using the Bethlehem to Philadelphia branch of the railroad, stopping at stations along the way. Although it didn't stop in Hatfield, it did pass through. The Hatfield Invincible newspaper reported, "Quite a number of our people were on the lookout to see the Liberty Bell pass, which was due here at 11 o'clock. On account of the disagreeable weather, the train was 2 hours late." So that's the story of the Liberty Bell's very brief visit through Hatfield in 1893. Dr. Frank E. Boston, who founded the Volunteer Medical Service Corps in 1933 and started Elm Terrace Hospital in Lansdale a year later in 1934, has been receiving quite a bit of press recently, so here's a Hatfield Speedway incident that I learned about recently that involved Dr. Boston. In June of 1937, Dr. Boston was on standby at the Hatfield racetrack for the weekly stock car races. The first race of the day was marred by a 3-car accident that injured 3 drivers. 2 of them escaped the wreckage, but a 27-year-old driver was pinned in his car, which burst into flames. The crash pushed the engine block back on top of the driver's legs, locking him in place within inches of the flames. A crowd of 5,000 looked on in horror as the man screamed for help. The Hatfield Fire Company was called and responded as quickly as possible, and in the meantime, nearby spectators resorted to throwing mud on the flames until the firemen arrived. Dr. Boston rushed to the burning car and determined that the trapped driver suffered a fractured leg and multiple deep lacerations and burns. He treated them as best as he could, all the while the fire continued to flare up from gasoline flowing from a ruptured fuel line. 25 agonizing minutes later, the driver was finally freed from the wreckage and rushed to the hospital in Lansdale in critical condition. Remarkably, his condition improved substantially over the next few days, and he was able to be transferred to a hospital closer to his home in New Jersey. And this is just one of many heroic deeds performed in his lifetime by Dr. Frank Boston. On the afternoon of September 17, 1898, residents of the North Penn area witnessed a violent storm that left a trail of destruction from Percy to Hatfield and beyond. 2 funnel clouds swept through the area simultaneously. One tore through farms and towns from Trumbowersville to Hatfield, and the other originated along Bethlehem Pike near Percy, where hailstones as large as hen's eggs shattered windows and covered the ground several inches deep. This second storm then traveled on a line through Sellersville, and on to Hatfield. The two storms converged at Hatfield Borough, resulting in disaster for the new borough that was formed just 3 months earlier. Residents sought refuge in cellars, and remarkably, no lives were lost, but dozens of buildings were leveled and many others were heavily damaged. Construction of George S. Snyder's new $10,000 mansion at Market Street and Lincoln Avenue was just nearing completion when it was struck by the storm, which carried away part of the roof. At the Hatfield train station, the platform at the station was lifted by the storm and carried across the tracks, together with tons of merchandise that was on the platform. Nearby, George Snyder's flour and feed mills were badly wrecked by the tornadoes. At the home of Dr. Titus Albright on Market Street, the back portico was destroyed, the roof damaged, and the back wall was pushed in about 6 inches. The newspaper account reported that the funnel cloud was witnessed by hundreds of people as it passed through Hatfield. You've been around for a while if you remember the Twin Kiss ice cream stand that was located at 1150 North Broad Street in Hatfield Township, where the Kia showroom used to be. This newspaper advertisement is from their grand opening in 1960. The opening day special, all the root beer you could drink. In February 1903, Hatfield Borough's Board of Trade was organized, with George S. Snyder elected president and C.J. Buckley vice president. More than 20 men from the town attended the organizational meeting. The stated purpose of the new Board of Trade was to advance the business interests of the community, a precursor to the Chamber of Commerce, I suppose. At this first meeting, hotel owner Chester Knipe offered to donate a piece of ground at Union Street and Maple Avenue on which to build a factory and railroad siding for any suitable business that the board could attract to the town. Eventually, the North Penn Washer Factory was built on the property. This building still stands and is now an auto body shop. George S. Snyder would only live another 8 years after the Board of Trade was organized, dying at the young age of 55 from heart disease. His business, which he started in 1884, continued on as his legacy for over 90 years as the estate of George S. Snyder, the area's leading hardware store and home center. You may recall from previous programs that before Hatfield Borough was formed in 1898, the two villages in the middle of Hatfield Township were known as Upper Hatfield and Lower Hatfield. Lower Hatfield was also often referred to as South Hatfield, and Upper Hatfield was sometimes called Hatfield Station because the village grew in the area of the Hatfield train station. The September 4th, 1879 edition of the Schwenkville Item newspaper reported that the folks of Hatfield Station were, quote, agitating the question, or discussing, building a new church, with Reverend Joel Rosenberger of the Evangelical Mennonite Church the driving force behind the talks. The article goes on to report that it seemed most folks were favorable to the idea, and it was felt that a new church was not too far off. And it came to pass that about a year later a new church did open nearby. Known as the Hatfield New Mennonite Church, the building was located on what is now West Broad Street and is now the Bethany Bible Fellowship. This is the oldest picture that we have of the original Hatfield New Mennonite Church building. Back in December, the Society was contacted by a representative of Deco Sales Company who, in 2010, purchased the Rosenberger's Dairies facility located in Westchester. The company took the Rosenberger's Dairy sign that hung on the building and had it restored and placed on the wall in the president's office as a tribute to their local history. The company is now selling the building and was looking for a new home for the sign. At 8 feet in length, it was just too big for the Hatfield History Museum, but we were fortunately able to connect with a member of the Rosenberger family who was thrilled for the opportunity to have the sign. I thought you might also enjoy seeing this sign from the local business that had such a long history here in Hatfield from 1925 to 2002. And while we're on the topic of Rosenbergers, let's look at some other memorabilia from the business. Here's a photo I came across recently online. Some of you will remember when the Rosenbergers Dairy's horse-drawn delivery wagon was a regular in local parades. The wagon was apparently sold by Sotheby's auction house in 2017 for $6,900. Also sold at that auction was the Rosenbergers Dairy's horse-drawn delivery sleigh. It sold for only $1,150. I also came across this nice photo of a Rosenbergers Dairy's milk can. I wish we had one of these in our museum collection. And one more Rosenbergers photo. You may recognize this as the inside of the Rosenbergers Dairy Wagon shop that operated on Coffle Road from 1970 until around 2014. A wonderful place to get a great sandwich and ice cream. A May 1893 Hatfield Invincible news note reported that the Roos brothers had opened a cheese factory in the Unionville section of Hatfield Township. It also reported that the brothers both were sporting elegant Colombian bicycles, like these seen here, and that the brothers were both good riders. A month later, a newspaper reported that one brother, William, along with Grant Rosenberger of Calmer, mounted their bicycles and set off for Cape May and Atlantic City. By the time they returned home, they had traveled around 300 miles. Can you imagine traveling that far on the unpaved roads of that day on a single-speed bicycle? Quite an accomplishment. Now, I'm sure that with all of their riding, the Roos brothers were quite capable of repairing their own machines, but for those who weren't, they could take their bicycles to the Hatfield Carriage Works, which was located on what is now Blaine Avenue in Hatfield Borough. In addition to building and repairing carriages and wagons, the business also specialized in repairing bicycles, as we can see from this 1898 newspaper advertisement. Croquet was quite a popular sport here in Hatfield and the surrounding communities in the late 1800s, enjoyed by young and old alike. This photo shows some unidentified Hatfield folks warming up for a game. There was also great community rivalry playing the game of croquet. This article reports on 2 games played on a Saturday in October 1893 between teams from Hatfield and Lansdale. Hatfield had a good day and won both matches. It is said that necessity is the mother of invention. Well, that certainly seems to have been the case with this prosthetic leg, which was invented around 1865. Joseph Detweiler Hagee was born April 1st, 1841 in Hatfield Township. In the summer of 1862, at the age of 21, Hagee enlisted as a private with the 138th Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry to serve in the Civil War. He fought in a long list of battles and skirmishes, including a 2-day battle at the Wilderness in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, in May of 1864. A month later, at the Battle of Cold Harbor, Virginia, Hagee was slightly wounded in the left ear. Later that same year, during the Battle of Petersburg, Virginia, Hagee was severely wounded, requiring that his leg be amputated 5 inches above the knee. After he was discharged in June of 1865, Hagee returned to Hatfield, where he worked as a bootmaker. He became dissatisfied with his government-issued prosthesis, so he decided to make something new and different. His handcrafted prosthesis is made of wood covered in leather, with metal springs. The foot is made of two separate pieces of wood shaped like a human foot and held together with leather so that the toe section could bend. The bottom of the foot is covered in leather to make for more cushioned walking. The ankle is movable due to metal springs which attach it to the metal calf. Leather straps act like a garter to hold the prosthetic leg in place around the knee. This fascinating piece of technology, crafted by a Hatfield Township bootmaker, is now in the collection of the Montgomery County Historical Society. By the 1960s, traffic on Route 309 between Hatfield and Quakertown was becoming a problem, with constant traffic jams occurring in Sellersville Borough. To solve this problem, in 1967, work began on a freeway to bypass Sellersville. The Sellersville Bypass project also included other work, including work on County Line Road in front of George's Tool Rental, Hatfield Township, as seen in this 1968 photo. A ribbon-cutting ceremony celebrating the opening of the Route 309 Sellersville Bypass was held in March of 1969 at the southern end of the bypass. So many local and state officials turned out for the ceremony that they created their own traffic jam. This photo was taken on the northern edge of Hatfield Township, looking south towards Unionville Pike. The new limited access road enabled those traveling between Hatfield and Quakertown to bypass the borough of Sellersville, greatly reducing travel time. In September 1957, the Ford Motor Company introduced a brand new car model into an already crowded auto market, the Edsel. That same month, September 1957, car dealer George McGinnis decided to expand his network of auto agencies to include the new Edsel. He ran an advertisement in the Reporter newspaper announcing that he would build a dealership at 1315 North Broad Street in Hatfield Township to sell the Edsel, touted as the car of the future, loaded with first-in-the-industry features. Unfortunately, the Edsel just didn't live up to all of its hype, and the quality of the car was often actually subpar. Meanwhile, construction of McGinnis's new building in Hatfield had proceeded to the point where the showroom had almost been completed, but by then the Edsel was already being labeled as a failure, and the plug was pulled on opening new dealerships. Ford finally discontinued the Edsel in September of 1959 after making just a few 1960 models. The building at 1315 North Broad Street became Royal Cleaners, and to this day, the word Edsel is synonymous with failure, and the Ford Motor Company ended up losing many millions of dollars on the car. Trade cars were one of the most prevalent forms of business advertising in the U.S. from around 1875 to 1900. They had their origin in England in the 1700s, with tradesmen using them to advertise their wares. The advent of lithography in the 1870s made it possible to mass-produce trade cards in color. Like advertising today, many trade cards used either humor or pretty women to sell their products. Unlike today, children and flowers were also often used. Victorians were apparently fascinated by children. Most trade cards have a picture on one side and an ad on the other. Sometimes the back is blank if the front also contains the ad. Most of the pictures are in color, although some are simply black and white. We have a good number of trade cards from Hatfield businesses in our collection at the Hatfield History Museum, and this is a recent addition to our collection. The other side of the card shows that it is from Charles Buchenauer, a fashionable tailor with practical experience. So far, I have been unable to determine just where in Hatfield it was that Mr. Buchenauer had his tailor shop. This trade card is from a Mr. A.R. News, who sold groceries and provisions somewhere in the area of the Hatfield train station. This trade card, as well as most of these other Hatfield trade cards, are likely from the time frame of 1880 to 1895. This card is from Charles Wieland, a boot and shoemaker, also located somewhere in the vicinity of the Hatfield train station. He chose a flower for his card. Isaac Culp chose to use children for his earlier trade cards, although why he chose these two is beyond me. You have the smiling baby in a bowl on the left and the not-so-happy baby on the right. Isaac Culp had a flour, feed, and coal business on South Main Street near where Gottschall's garage is now. And we can also see that long and short-cut hay was his specialty. Later, apparently, Culp decided to modernize his trade card with the colorful use of flowers. These three cards are from D.L.O. Culp, who operated a printing business in Hatfield from the early 1880s until 1894. Perhaps cricket was also a popular sport in Hatfield at that time, since he chose to use children playing that game on his trade cards. This is what I would call a fantasy-style trade card. It is also from D.L.O. Culp, who operated the Keystone Card Company as part of his printing business. We can see that a businessman could have 100 of these trade cards printed for only 75 cents or 1,000 for only $6. Another fantasy trade card. In 1880, Eli Ziegler and Charles Myers purchased a South Hatfield store business at Main and Vine Streets. Like general stores of that time, they carried everything: dry goods, groceries, hardware, drugs, paints, etc. Trade cards disappeared around the turn of the 20th century when newspaper advertising became the preferred marketing venue, but then eventually made a comeback. Only today we call them business cards. Many of you will probably recognize this building, located at the corner of Cowpath and Overbrook Roads, as the former home of Dr. Gordon Lupin and most recently Dr. Stephen Sklar. But before the building was used as a doctor's office, it was the home of Detra Radio Service. Harold Detra, who started his radio service business back in 1934, moved the business into this new building in 1947. As you may know, I love pictures of old horse-drawn Hatfield business wagons like this one from I.C. Detweiler's General Store. I think it is the hand-painted lettering that makes them special for me. But I also enjoy old Hatfield business trucks as well. Here's the Detra Radio Service truck waiting to be serviced at Ebert Motors on South Broad Street in Lansdale. Detra continued to operate his business here until 1958, and then around 1972, Dr. Lupin moved his medical practice into the former Detra building. In 1887, George S. Snyder, who had a small feed mill in South Hatfield, purchased a competing feed business on Market Street in Upper Hatfield. This purchase also added coal and lumber to his product line, and for the next 120 years, George S. Snyder would sell lumber. Still, there are very few photos showing his lumber yard. This early 1900s photo is the oldest one that we have, showing a time when all of Snyder's lumber was stored under cover. It wasn't long, though, before high demand for lumber meant that Snyder's couldn't store all of its stock under roof, so storage was moved outside into the yard, so to speak. That's the lumber shed on the right, where some of the lumber was still stored under cover. While this photo, which was taken from the roof of the former Hatfield Washer building at Union Street and Maple Avenue, was actually taken to capture the Vernon Hartman home in the center of the picture, it's nice that it also captures stacks of lumber in a portion of the Snyder's lumber yard at that time. This photo from around 1910 shows that same area, only from street level. North Market Street would run right between the middle of these four houses. And this is what it looks like today. In addition to old maps, delivery wagons, and trucks, I really like things built of fieldstone. Quarried stone, not so much, but fieldstone has a special rustic look that I really like, whether it's a house, a stone border wall, or a bridge, like the Lincoln Avenue Bridge seen here. This double-span stone arch bridge was built in 1900, and this picture was taken just a few years later. This view is looking upstream or north towards Broad Street. Of course, when the bridge was built, it was only traversed by horse and wagon traffic, but more recently, it had borne the weight of many cars, trucks, and even tractor-trailers on a daily basis. This photo shows the same side of the bridge taken 5 years ago. And this photo was taken in May of 2021 and shows the other side, the north side of the bridge. All of that vehicular traffic took its toll on the 120-year-old stone bridge, and sadly it needed to be replaced. This photo from June of 2021 shows crews starting work on the bridge replacement project. The new bridge is now a single-span bridge, like this one seen here, which allows water to pass through more freely. I've already mentioned several tidbits pertaining to George S. Snyder and the Snyder business. That was his legacy. But perhaps to some, Snyder's is best known and remembered for Snyderama. In March 1971, the estate of George S. Snyder moved from its location on Market Street in Hatfield Borough into a new modern hardware store building on Cowpath Road just outside of the borough. 3 years later, in 1974, the store conducted its very first Snyderama, a 3-day festival of merchandising and entertainment for both the community and the store personnel. This photo shows a packed-out parking lot during that very first Snyderama event in 1974, 50 years ago. The annual Snyderama event was extremely popular, drawing families from throughout the greater North Penn area to enjoy a petting zoo, clowns, jugglers, arts and crafts, pony rides, pet shows, live entertainment, lumberjack shows, and pig races. And of course, there were the 10-cent hot dogs and drinks. In 1996, folks got to meet some of their favorite Philadelphian childhood television stars at Snyderama. One was Gene London, who was the creator and host of a long-running children's television program, Cartoon Corners, also known as The Gene London Show. His program aired on WCAU Channel 10 in Philadelphia from 1959 to 1977. There was also Buffalo Bob, a children's television personality who was well known as the host of the popular children's show Howdy Doody. And I must admit, although I do remember watching Gene London, I don't believe that I ever saw the Howdy Doody show. And finally, there was Chief Halftown, the Native American Indian entertainer who hosted a children's show that aired on WFIL-TV in Philadelphia from 1950 to 1999, 49 years. I never realized that his show ran that long. Originally intended for a 6-week series, his show went on to become the world's longest-running local TV children's show. This Snyderama 96 card featuring Chief Halftown is a recent addition to the Hatfield History Museum's collection. And that is our 2024 edition of This and That, an eclectic look at Hatfield history. I hope that you have enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.